From the Times, this is The World in 10. With me today, Michael Kugelman, a long-time South Asia analyst, joining us from Washington. Michael, hi.
Hi.
We're hearing this warning from Pakistan's defense minister, an imminent military incursion by India. What, in your view, is the likelihood of a hot war between India and Pakistan?
I mean, the good news is that I think a hot war, an all-out war, is quite unlikely. Ever since India and Pakistan became formal nuclear states in the late 1990s, they really have held off from wars. I mean, yes, they have fought multiple wars with each other, several of them over the Kashmir issue, but those all happened before they became former nuclear states. And so what we've seen in more recent years are some, limited exchanges that don't last very long. And I think that that's likely what will happen in this case. Of course, though, one can never be complacent when you're talking about two nuclear neighboring nemeses. It's a very unusual situation to have this type of situation of two countries that have nuclear weapons and have fought multiple wars in the past. So I think that important to to assume that things will not escalate to a worst case scenario, but nothing can be ruled out.
What would that worst case scenario look like? Just how damaging could a major war be?
And I think a worst case scenario would essentially be a case of the two countries essentially engaging in conflict with each other over a period that goes beyond a few days, and that goes beyond simply having an Indian airstrike in Pakistan and a Pakistani response. That's essentially been the template that we've seen with crises between these two countries since they became nuclear states. The longer the two countries engage in military action against each other, the more you have to worry about escalation risks getting to a nuclear level. And this is not something you'd have to worry about if these were not two countries with nuclear weapons.
I've got memories of sitting in Islamabad and sitting in Delhi as these escalations have spiked up in years gone by. You touched on the 2019 where it was an airstrike that seemed to end it. Mostly during these escalations, it's been talked down. Is it different this time?
I mean, it's hard to say because the level of anger in India is particularly high, and that's because of the nature of the attack that precipitated this crisis. As you know, you had a situation where 26 civilians, tourists, were gunned down execution style. They were also targeted because of their religion, for being Hindus. And Kashmir, of course, does have a legacy of violence and militancy, but rarely are civilians hit, particularly in a case like this. I think for that reason, the level of anger is particularly high in India, certainly within the government, and the military, but also within the public. And I would also note that, just sort of in terms, based on my conversations with friends and network and contacts in India, it's a sense that India feels that this time they need to do things a bit differently, in the sense that they haven't properly restored deterrence, in that there have been other attacks in India-administered Kashmir and India more broadly in recent years. And India has responded with airstrikes meant to target terrorist infrastructure, but that these attacks continue to periodically happen, including the one that happened most recently. And so I'm getting a sense that the government feels that this time it needs to restore deterrence once and for all. And that suggests, if you think that through, game that out, what that could mean, it suggests that one airstrike or a series of airstrikes on terrorist infrastructure might not be enough from an Indian perspective. And that then raises the likelihood of, Pakistani retaliations and, back and forth. And that suggests that things could be different. I hope not. I really do think that at the end of the day, both countries will not want to go beyond, an initial strike and a retaliation. But given the sentiments in New Delhi, we can't rule out something different.
Talk us through why Kashmir is such a flashpoint between India and Pakistan.
Yeah, I mean, very briefly, I mean, Kashmir is interwoven with the founding identities of both India and Pakistan as independent states. If you go back to independence, back to partition in 1947, it was obviously an extremely traumatic, deadly affair. And essentially, you had a situation where areas of colonial era India that were Hindu majority became post post-colonial India, independent India, and those areas that were Muslim majority became part of the new state of Pakistan. But with Kashmir, a Muslim majority region, things didn't follow that same pattern. And essentially, and I'm simplifying things here, basically what happened is the leadership in Kashmir agreed to a term of accession with India, which meant that it was essentially agreeing to be a part of India. That then provoked a war between Pakistan and India, and the issue has never been settled. And it's been such a fraught issue that it's led to multiple wars between India and Pakistan. There has been some over the years, some efforts on the part of the UN to try to mediate, but the UN's position going back many years is that there needs to be a demilitarization on both sides of the disputed border that separates Pakistan and India-administered Kashmir, and you haven't had that. It's a very highly securitized region. So, bottom line, what you have today is that India administers part of Kashmir, Pakistan administers part of Kashmir, but both countries claim all of it, and that's where we stand.
The deadly attack in Kashmir came with J.D. Vance in India on his 4-day visit. With all of these foreign policy challenges that the White House faces, how do you see the Trump administration navigating this potential for either a hot war or a continuing dispute between India and Pakistan?
Right. Yeah, the fact that Vance was there when this attack happened, was in India when this attack happened, is I think quite significant. It suggests that those behind the attack wanted to get the U.S.'s attention, to get it to focus its attention on Kashmir, which is something that the U.S. government tends to not pay much attention to, quite frankly. It views it, and this is what India wants. It views it as a bilateral dispute between India and Pakistan for the U.S. or any other external player not to get involved with. But in terms of what we could expect for the U.S. role, I mean, of course, it's very hard to make predictions about the Trump administration because it's unpredictable by definition. And we've seen some inconsistent messaging coming from the administration. Initially, there was a lot of predictably, understandably, strong message of support and solidarity with India after the attack happened. But then you had President Trump in recent days essentially say that India and Pakistan will figure this out eventually, suggesting that he wouldn't want the U.S. to get involved playing any type of mediation role. But then in more recent days, we've had the State Department essentially indicate that it planned to engage with both India and Pakistan, including the Secretary of State. So there's been those engagements, and the State Department has called for the two sides not to escalate. If you look at the history, there is a precedent of the U.S. governments intervening during India-Pakistan crises, including the most recent one in 2019. Mike Pompeo published a memoir a few years ago, and he basically said that the U.S. played a very significant mediating role and prevented the situation from escalating to a nuclear risk. So there is that precedent. We all know that President Trump himself, he views himself as a negotiator, as a peace broker. He's been trying to do that in Gaza and Ukraine. So one would think that he and his administration would welcome this opportunity to play that role. I would also argue that for all we hear about the very deep relationship between the U.S. and India, that's true. The U.S. has warm relations with India, but it also has pretty workable relations with Pakistan. This administration has indicated a desire to cooperate with Pakistan in particular areas, including counterterrorism. So that suggests that the U.S. might be seen as a viable mediator by both India and Pakistan. But at the end of the day, we don't know. There's a lot on this administration's plate. I think if we're talking about external involvement, external mediation, we should talk about the U.S., but also talk about other countries. In particular, I would emphasize the Arab Gulf states, the Saudis, the Emiratis, the Qataris, just because they have very deep relations with both India and Pakistan, and they have a lot of leverage. They supply significant amounts of energy to India and Pakistan and other forms of assistance. And there's also a precedent. The UAE, for example, actually helped mediate a truce between India and Pakistan in early 2021 along their disputed border. So I think that mediation, obviously, the more this crisis escalates, if there actually is a conflict, the more likelihood you would have mediation attempts. I'm sure the U.S. would be a part of it, but I do think that other players would be a part of the story too.
Donald Trump seems to have a fairly close and seemingly warm personal relationship with Narendra Modi, the Indian Prime Minister. How big a deal was it that we heard Modi using some quite fiery language, warning Pakistan He was speaking in English rather than the usual Hindi or Gujarati. Was that a big deal?
Absolutely. I mean, this is a very striking development about this particular crisis that I think is different from what we've seen in some of the more recent previous crises. Clearly, not just the Indian side, but also the Pakistani side are trying to appeal to global audiences. And I think that they're essentially trying to get buy-in for their position from the international community. And for India, it essentially wants the world to rally behind India and see it as a victim of terrorism, and embrace India's position that it's repeatedly been victimized by Pakistan-sponsored terrorism, and that India deserves support and a free hand to deal with that problem, including staging kinetic actions. Whereas with Pakistan, its position is that it's been wrongly blamed for an attack that it had nothing to do with, and that it wants to paint India as the aggressor, because India, according to Pakistan's position, has sponsored terrorist attacks in Pakistan. And it's interesting. While both countries, particularly India, would say that this is for them to figure out, it's a bilateral issue. At the end of the day, they both view the importance of global narratives, particularly global media coverage, what the major prestigious outlets around the world are saying about the conflict. This is very important for these two countries, and that helps explain why seeing these appeals and these speeches made in English. I would also note that both India and Pakistan have held briefings for foreign diplomats to again get their side of the story to convey to these diplomats, and hope that they'll take that back to their bosses back home.
While all of this has been going on, India and Pakistan have both been seemingly competing to see who can downgrade ties with the other fastest, whether that's blocking aircraft from flying over the other's territory, or suspending the treaty that divides up water supplies. How damaging are these moves to both countries?
Yeah, I mean, this is another reason why things are a bit different now with this crisis than they have been in some of the recent previous crises, because we've seen some unprecedented diplomatic retaliations being taken. You refer to the Indus Waters Treaty. India has never suspended that. It's threatened to. It's signaled that it would consider it in the past, but it had never done it until today. And then with Pakistan reciprocating by backing out of another very significant bilateral treaty that's endured during the worst times for the relationship. I think that shows that there's very little diplomatic space in place for the two sides to be able to find a way to hold dialogues to try to reach an end to this crisis, to diffuse it. That's why I'm quite convinced that there will be some type of military exchange between the two. The good news is that we have seen in recent days that these hotlines that are used by India and Pakistani military officials during crises, those do, as of at the moment when we're speaking now, they remain open for business, so to speak. That's critical, because my first thought when I heard that these critical bilateral treaties were being canceled or were being suspended is that you no longer have any mechanisms to allow for communication between the two sides. But if the hotlines are being tapped into, that's a good thing. But I would say this, that even though we're talking about unprecedented steps here with suspension of these treaties, I don't necessarily think that these steps are hugely escalatory, just because they were diplomatic. They did not entail the use of force or anything like that. And the fact that Pakistan reciprocated what India did, that's not escalatory as well, because it didn't do anything different from what India did. It was simply, predictably returning the favor, so to speak, to India.
Digging into the decades that you've spent watching this relationship, what do you think it would take to get the relationship patched up to perhaps avoid military action?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that the last few years have actually been fairly stable for India-Pakistan relations. They signed a truce along their disputed border in 2021. Things have been relatively calm, and I remember a few years back, in an Indian ballistic missile, pardon me, an Indian supersonic missile, suddenly flew across the air into Pakistan, and that was huge. And India said that it was a mistake that happened during a training exercise. Pakistan was thought that India might have done it on purpose to test Pakistan's response. If relations had been worse, that could have led to a conflict. But Pakistan had issued an angry statement and then they moved on. So I think that both sides in recent years have actually had an interest in a relationship that is relatively workable, just because they've both been wanting to focus on other things. In the case of India, wanting to focus on the strategic challenge posed by China. And in terms of Pakistan, it's been dealing with internal turmoil, economic stress, rise in terrorism, political tensions, and so on. So I think that neither side wanted to have to be distracted or burdened by another crisis. But those of us that monitor in India-Pakistan relations know that even when things are going relatively well with the relationship, it could only take one triggering act for all that progress to be lost, and that's exactly what happened. In terms of what needs to be done now to avoid military conflict, I think that the space in the immediate term, there's not much space to avoid that. I think that mediation can work in due course, but not until we get to a point where there already has been some Indian military action taken and Pakistani responses. Again, I think it's important to note that since both countries went nuclear, when the two countries have used military force against each other, it's been limited, typically consists of India retaliating to a terrorist attack, Pakistan responding in kind, and then things calm down. That's when the mediation, I think, can be most effective. But if you look at this over the broader term, over the longer term, what could be done to bring peace to India-Pakistan relations? It's just really tough. There have been some cases in the past where there were some peace processes that were taken forward, including one not too long ago, several decades ago, when Pervez Musharraf was president of Pakistan and Manmohan Singh was India's prime minister. There was a peace deal underway, and they made a lot of progress. But then Pakistani terrorists carried out this horrific terrorist attack in Mumbai in 2008, and that essentially ended all hopes of a peace process. So that's what I say, that even if things look like they can be going well, it just takes one spoiler, one triggering act to set back all the progress.
Michael, thank you so much.
Thank you.